This is Adam Marcus, director of Jason Goes to Hell and Secret Santa, and you are listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian.
Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream, Chapter 10. A flickering red light lit up the darkness of the boiler room, filling the gloom with dancing shadows like the spirits of the dead. The room was hot. Here and there small jets of steam hissed out of the pipes, immediately evaporating in the dry heat. A jumble of nondescript machinery filled the corners of the room, tangled with wires and power cords and the remains of broken tools. The air was thick with dust, and spiderwebs draped the corners and crevices, weaving a dusty white skin around the rotting copper pipes, turning inorganic machinery into spectral white shapes. There was a whimper in the darkness. Steam hissed above the clink of machinery, and a long, drawn-out grating sound resembled an iron door being dragged shut. A sudden wash of red light flooded the room, throwing a shadow across the walls and up onto the ceiling, like a giant black spider. The shadow of a man. The shadow moved across the ceiling, slid along the far wall, then grew smaller, as though the man was walking forward, away from the source of the light. Another whimper sounded, low and hopeless. The man paused briefly, then moved on. A workbench sat in the corner of the room, by the stairs that led up to a heavy iron door. A dirty curtain hung down from the ceiling, blocking the view of the door. There was a set of silver knives on the worktop, arranged neatly according to size, running from the largest to smallest like a window display. One of the larger knives still had the store tag on it. To the left of them sat a large sack of scrapbooks, along with the white plastic bag from a grocery store, the top tied in a knot. Footsteps sounded in the darkness. A moment later, the bag was tossed aside and the book was slammed down on the bench. A large tome with black covers and an embossed gold spine. A yearbook. Dirty hands reached down and opened the front cover. A calloused thumb ran down the index page, then the man pulled the book open at the center pages, cracking the spine, and gazed hungrily down. Dozens of black and white faces beamed out. Children's faces, no older than 16 or 17. Good-looking, happy faces with shiny hair, perfect skin, and pearly white teeth. High school kids. The man reached up and scratched a stubble on his chin thoughtfully, staring hungrily down at the pictures. Pretty, pretty kids, all the way from elementary to high school. So young, so perfect. They had their whole lives ahead of them, their clear eyes and wide smiles reflecting a boundless optimism that was alien to the man. The kids had no idea what the future held for them and mostly didn't care, so long as it involved fun things like football and cheerleading and cars and sex. The man's hands tightened on the cover of the yearbook. He had never had those years. No smiling, happy faces for him. The man flicked rapidly through the pages, feeling his long, dormant hatred start to build. The kids were so cheerful, so young, so fresh. A stab of black jealousy shot through him, like a cold snake winding its way down his backbone. His high school years had been wasted, spent in a haze of self-loathing, of trudging through life while his peers had got all of the breaks. They hung out, went to parties, got laid, got on with life without so much as a second thought, as though it was the most simple thing in the world. It seemed to come so easily to them, almost like taking a breath. Whereas with him, everything had been an effort. He had scraped through classes somehow, but it hadn't been enough. Not by a long shot. For as every kid knew, school wasn't about learning stuff. It was about being popular, being liked, being accepted. He had never been any of those things. It had started in kindergarten, where the kids teased him for being adopted. Even now, as an adult with a family, a job, a wife, he still heard their voices in his head. He couldn't shut them out, no matter how hard he tried. See that boy? His mommy didn't like him, so she threw him out just like the garbage. Endless children's laughter ringing in his head. His stepfather had beaten him each time he had run away, and eventually he had just given up. But he had tried. Oh God, had he tried. He tried to fit in and had been rejected. He had tried to be liked and ended up being despised. He had tried to be good and everything had turned out bad. High school had been the worst. Here all his neuroses and problems had been thrown sharply into focus, dragged squirming out into the light, and held up for all to laugh at. For this was a time of proms and parties, of being accepted to be at his best, when he looked and felt his absolute worst. Sometimes he would creep back into the empty upstairs classroom during lunch break, turn out the lights, then just sit and watch the kids out in the playground down below. He would look in on envy as the boys ran around on the grassy field shouting to one another and messing around with baseballs and bikes, while the girls sat on the wall watching them, pointing and giggling to one another. They never seemed to actually achieve anything, but they all seemed to be having such a great time. Then one by one couples would pair off. Cliques would form, and the next thing he knew, he was the boy who sat by himself every lunchtime, rejected yet again. They had no right to be so happy when he was so miserable. No right. The harder he tried, the worse things got. He just had no idea how to fit in with the other kids. Social interaction was a mystery to him. He would watch them, try to analyze their behavior, to unpick what they were doing so that he could learn it and do it too. But the harder he tried, the more he was teased. And in the end, he had given up and accepted his role as the social outcast. The one who didn't belong. The freak. The man reached down, picked up the smallest knife from the workbench, and absent-mindedly cleaned the grime from his fingernails with the sharp tip. As he gazed down at the row and rows of smiling faces, an image welled up in his mind. The man shook his head to try and dislodge it, but it was no good. He was 17 again, and he was having his own yearbook photo taken. He had tried to skip school to avoid the ordeal, but had been caught by a mean-faced teacher at the main gate and marched back up the drive to school. The resultant picture had shown a sallow-faced, skinny youth with limp hair, pale skin, acne, and a thin, grudging smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked as beaten and dejected as he felt. He had hated the picture with a passion, and had invested a considerable amount of time and effort tracking down every copy of that yearbook and burning them. It hadn't helped, though. He saw that image every time he looked in the mirror. It showed him for what he was, a loser, a failure. He failed in everything he tried to do, from dating to friends to work. He was a failure, and he hated everyone who wasn't, especially the kids. A drop of blood splashed down onto the yearbook, staining the page. The man grimaced and sucked on his finger, then put the knife down onto the bench. A whimper came from the girl sitting bound and gagged in the corner of the room. The man swung around to face her, his nostrils flaring in contempt. She was blonde, no older than 15, and was terrified out of her mind. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, soaking the gag that silenced her. She was wearing a thin green gown, such as might be found on the inmates of a hospital, or a mental asylum. The man studied her impassively for a moment. Then he turned back to the yearbook. The blood ran down the page, tracing a crimson line between the pictures. The man brushed it off with a finger and turned back a couple of pages, going through the alphabet until he found the surname he was looking for. Ah, there she was. Perfect. The perfect picture showed another young girl, glossy-haired and high cheekboned. The name beneath read Elizabeth Harris. The man ran a tongue over his dry lips. Then he leaned forward and picked up the knife again, then carefully scored around the edges of the picture. Licking his dirty fingers, he picked up the picture and laid it in the palm of his hand, studying it through narrowed eyes. "Jack!" The man jumped, spinning around and dropping the picture. It fluttered to the floor, and he quickly scooped it up and stuffed it into his pocket. Then he turned and ripped back the curtain, marching over to the stairs. At the top, the door was open a crack. Bright yellow light spilled down, illuminating the dusty darkness. A woman's face shyly peered around the edge of the door. She was thin as a mouse, with wispy blonde hair and a worried, pinched face. "Dinner's ready, honey." Jack Cain grabbed hold of the metal railing with the white-knuckled fist and turned his scowling face upwards into the light. Muscles in his arm bunched as he fought to contain his fury. "I'm working!" he growled. "I told you not to disturb me when I'm working!" The woman took a step backward, her hands fluttering in confusion. "But dinner's on the table, and I just thought you might—" "I'm not hungry!" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Get out of here!" Cain bellowed. Cain spun on his heel and ducked back under the curtain, muttering oaths to himself. A few seconds later, he heard the door click shut again. The sound of muffled sobbing floated quietly down the metal stairs. Jack ignored it. Stupid bitch! What did she know? He pulled the crumpled picture out of his pocket and tossed it down onto the bench, then pulled one of the scrapbooks out of the pile and opened it at random. The pages were crammed with dozens of newspaper cuttings, torn and yellowed with age. He flicked through the pages. All the cuttings were about the same case, the same person. Cain gazed down at them, his eyes roving over the dramatic headlines. Springwood slasher strikes again. Lock up your children. 13th child missing, parents hold candlelight vigil. Cain turned the pages till he came to the last cutting. He read it through carefully, as he had done 1,000 times before this day. Kruger strikes again. From beyond the grave? This was the last cutting. After that, nothing. It was almost as if someone was covering it up. And they were covering it up. Cain knew it all off by heart. He had stumbled across the case by accident, while working for the Springwood Police Department. After that, it had become almost an obsession. He knew all about the mysterious deaths of Tina Gray, her boyfriend Rob, and all the dozens of other kids who had died on Elm Street, slaughtered by an invisible maniac in their dreams. Oh yes, he knew all about what went on at 1428 Elm Street. Donald Thompson had lived at that address. Thompson was a police officer, and had been part of the crowd of righteous parents and town officials who had gone to Kruger's murderous lair. He had been the first to throw a Molotov cocktail in through the window, wreaking a terrible kind of justice when the courts could do nothing. Freddy was burned alive in his own killing room. But then, later, the other deaths had started. Shocking, brutal, inexplicable. The older Elm Street kids had started to die one by one. People tried to blame the deaths on drugs, on teenage craziness, on anything other than Freddy. But Cain knew what really went on. He listened to the whispers at the police station, hacked into files, read secret documents. It was a cover-up. For Freddy had come back from the dead. Cain had known it. As bizarre as it seemed, Freddy was punishing his killers by slaughtering their kids. Soon all the children of the original Elm Street parents were dead. But that didn't stop Freddy. Nothing stopped Freddy. It was that goddamn house, 1428 Elm Street. For each new family who moved in, Freddy would find a way to come back and continue his reign of terror. All it took was for one kid to discover his name, and Freddy would start appearing in their dreams, terrorizing them, using them to spread the fear before butchering them in their sleep. So the cops and officials had gotten together, clamped down on the town, hauled any kid who found out about Freddy off to Weston Hills, dosed them up on Hypnosil to stop them from dreaming. They hoped to break the chain, to starve Freddy of the fear he so desperately needed to survive. But it hadn't worked that way. Freddy would not be beaten so easily. With each year that passed, the more vicious his killings became. The cops were scared shitless, all out of ideas about how to save their town. Cain had taken advantage of this position of power, getting his new identity as a mental health worker had been as simple as going into the town records, rejigging a few of his qualifications, then wham, instant promotion. He worked with the kids up at Weston, the so-called crazies, finding out what they knew. Most of them were too far gone to be of much use, their minds destroyed through years of untested, unlicensed hypnosil therapy, unhinged by years of dreamless sleep. But Cain worked with them all, hoping to discover the secret of Freddy. Then, with one kid, he had struck fucking gold, and no one suspected a thing. For good old Jack Cain cared about the kids. Those goddamn kids! Cain's eyes glistened in the dark. Freddy was free to maim, torture, and kill the ones he despised, and he got away with it. What power! Even after they killed him, he didn't stop, his powers seeming to grow greater with each passing day. Nobody bullied him. No one made fun of him. He could do what he wanted to whoever he wanted, and nobody could stop him. Jack Cain would have killed to possess power like that. "Kruger, you old devil," Cain whispered to himself. He stroked the worn cuttings fondly, running his eye down the page like a caress. "How did you do it?" He cast a thoughtful eye over his own workshop. The knives on the workbench, the gardening gloves, the girl bound and gagged beneath the boiler. Everything was in place. But still something was missing. He pulled something out from under the cutting books, a case file, and tossed it down next to the picture. The name on the file read Jacob Harris. Cain smiled, then picked up the largest knife and got back to work. The wind ruffled Jacob's blood-caked hair as he gunned the Kawasaki down the dark highway, leaving the town center far behind him. The orange streetlights of the highway washed over his face. Dark light, dark light. He had long since stopped feeling the cold of the night, and now all he could feel was the rumble of the road beneath him, and the tension in his arms as he gripped the handlebars, squeezing them tight in a vain attempt to get the screaming out of his head. His blood-stained gown was gone, and in its place were a pair of black trousers, belted at the waist, and a white vest top, with the police department's official seal stamped across the chest. His feet were snug inside a pair of thick-soled army boots, which were a couple of sizes too big, but still serviceable. Patches of dried blood adhered to his forearms, but he'd scraped his hair back off his face with a rubber band, and now looked almost presentable, if not entirely sane. Jacob glanced into his rearview mirror, then shrugged his shoulders to readjust the backpack slung across his shoulders. The bag contained his 2 new pistols wrapped in a tan jacket, a couple of boxes of ammo, and a box of Krispy Kreme donuts that he'd found on the back seat of the second cop car. For the first time in over 5 years, he had a purpose. The glove box of the cop car had provided him with more than enough quarters to call a cell phone. Cain's voice on the other end had been strained, but Jacob had a very strong feeling that he'd been expecting his call. They'd spoken briefly, and then Cain had given him the address of a nearby strip joint, with strict instructions to ring him again from a call box across the street before entering the parking lot. He hadn't said anything about Freddy. Jacob stared ahead at the road while his head swam with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. Why had Cain helped him escape? What did he want? How had he managed to smuggle the gun in past security at Weston? Something nagged at Jacob's attention, and his focus snapped back to the road. The Kawasaki was slowing down, the engine whining as though something was dragging behind the bike. Jacob glanced into the rearview mirror but saw nothing. He applied the brake, then twisted the throttle again. The engine snarled at him, and the bike jumped, its frame rattling as though it were being pelted by invisible blows. Seriously freaked out, Jacob braked again and edged the bike into the slow lane. They were approaching Springwood's town limits, and he was going slower and slower by the second. He peeked at the dials in front of him. He had almost a full tank of gas, so why the hell was he slowing down? It was almost as if the bike didn't want to go any further. A roadside loomed in the darkness, and a very familiar name jumped out at Jacob. A shock of realization passed through him. He was nearly home. Home. He hadn't realized he was so close. All those years of incarceration at Weston Hills, and he'd been just a mile or so from his own house. A treacherous thought snuck into the back of his head. He was so close to home. Surely it wouldn't hurt to just drive by and have a look. He couldn't go in, of course. That would be the first place they'd look for him. But if the 2 cop cars and the helicopter represented Springwood's best attempts to recapture him, he figured he'd have a good half hour before the Neanderthals back at HQ figured out that their patrolmen were missing. Jacob leaned the bike into a tight bank, turning off the highway and streaking down the exit ramp toward the suburbs. Warehouses lined the street in an ugly sprawl of architectural incontinence. Empty corporate shells surrounded by chain-link fences. There was a gap of several streets, then the industrial buildings gave way to condominiums, then small apartments, then finally graceful white houses flanked by tall trees. Home. The houses that lined the streets were all darkened, and Jacob felt his hope fade a little, then rekindle as he saw the lights were on in one particular house. He drove up to the curb, wheeled his bike around into a space between 2 cars, and killed the engine. Sitting back in the saddle, he gazed up at the house that for 13 years had been his home. A simple white-painted house with wooden railings and a swing on the front porch. He had missed it so much. In his 5 years of incarceration, the thought of home had been the one thing that kept him going. He had so often dreamed of a time when he'd be allowed to go home and get on with his life. He'd pictured 1,000 times how he would go running up the front path, where his parents would sweep him up into their arms, laughing and crying with joy, before taking him inside for fresh, home-baked cookies and maybe a trip to the park, a long walk and a chance to catch up on the last 5 years. A wave of darkness swept over Jacob as reality hit him. It could never happen, of course. His father was dead and his mother was missing. She had disappeared shortly after they had taken him to Weston Hills, and nobody knew where she had gone. But still, it was a nice dream. Just then the kitchen light snapped on and a silhouette was revealed at the window. A very familiar silhouette. Jacob felt his heart speed up as he saw a dark figure stop by the window, then turn and stare out at him. It was a woman, but it wasn't his grandma, Mrs. Jordan, the witch woman who had stolen him from his mom as soon as he'd been born, proclaiming that she was an unfit and dangerous parent. It was his real mother, Alice. She was here. After all this time, his mother was here. He had been lied to, but why? Jacob felt a surge of longing bubble up in his chest. Blotting out the questions in his mind, he was off the bike and loping across the lawn toward her before his brain caught up with what he was doing. How was this even possible? Had she known somehow that he had escaped and that he would find his way back here? Could it have even been her who had bribed Cain to put the gun under his pillow in the first place? Fuck the cops, he had to find out. He paused behind a bush, gazing up at the kitchen window. Closer, he could see his mother's face, backlit by the kitchen light. She looked older and sadder, but was still as beautiful as she was in the picture they had given him. Her heart-shaped face framed by an unruly mop of soft curls, scraped back under a black bandana. A moment later, and his mother's eyes met his. Her mouth opened in surprise, then curved up into a smile of incredulous delight. She waved to Jacob frantically, then put a finger to her lips and glanced around behind her, as though making sure the coast was clear. Then she pointed a finger at the front door as if to say, "Stay there, I'm coming out." She clicked out the light and vanished from view. Jacob stopped in his tracks, wavering uncertainly. Then he darted across to a climbing wisteria bush and crouched down behind it. He waited, listening as hard as he could. The road was silent, save for the chirruping of crickets and the faint rustle of the midnight wind. Jacob's eyes swept up the road, listening for telltale sounds of police sirens. Nothing. Reassured, Jacob pushed himself to his feet, then began marching across the lawn to the front of the house, brushing the dirt off his pants as he went. He only wished that he'd looked more presentable. After all, it had been 5 years. He wanted to make a good first impression. He stepped off the lawn onto the path and began walking up toward it. He was halfway up the path when the front door creaked open. Overjoyed, Jacob rushed forward. Then he stopped, staring in horror. Freddy Krueger stood in the open doorway of his home, bold and brazen, grinning at him. Every muscle in Jacob's body froze, and he felt freezing tendrils of shock race through him. Choking back a cry of fury, he stared up at the putrefying madman who had ruined his life. Krueger's mouth was pulled upwards into a sneer, and his arms were crossed, his fingernails resting comfortably on his shoulders like spiny metal wings. His head was down, his wide-brimmed fedora hat throwing a shadow over his face. His eyes gleamed red as if lit from within by hellfire. "No!" Jacob swallowed and backed away, not daring to take his eyes off the grinning killer for a split second. How could this be happening? How? He had taken a double dose of Hypnosil just a few short hours ago, back at Weston Hills. There was no way that bastard could have got through to him if he was awake. Ah, shit! Jacob felt the world closing in on him. He spun on his heel and began racing back to his motorbike, as fast as his legs would take him. He knew in his gut that it was useless, but he'd be damned if he was going to give the son of a bitch the satisfaction of knowing he'd won. Behind him, he heard the sound of insane laughter, tearing through the still night air. Ah! Ha! 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 Then came a sound buried so deeply in Jacob's psyche that just hearing it made him feel like he was 5 years old again. The screeching of those goddamn fingerknives. Fuck! Jacob redoubled his efforts, sprinting across the lawn. Fear poured through him in an icy flood. He jumped the low picket fence and hit the sidewalk running, putting every ounce of his strength into his legs in an effort to put distance between himself and Krueger. But something was wrong. Something felt weird. Jacob glanced down at himself. His clothes had suddenly become about 5 sizes too big, and were whipping and flapping around him as he ran. Not only has his clothes grown, but he seemed to have shrunk. The ground was only 4 feet or so below him, and his legs seemed curiously weak and spindly. Then he realized what was wrong. He was 5 years old again. Little Jacob paused, his lungs heaving. He turned back toward Krueger and raised a furious finger in his direction. With his outsized clothes flapping around him, he reached the Kawasaki and stopped dead. The hopelessness of the situation suddenly dawned on him. He was 5 years old. How the hell was he going to ride a motorcycle? Gritting his teeth, Jacob tore down the road into the darkness. Fear gave him an extra jolt of speed, as the streetlights flickered and crackled above him. He had not gone more than a dozen yards before he realized he was slowing down again. He came to a halt, his legs spinning frantically on the ground, without moving him forward an inch, as in a cartoon. Then he started drifting backward, although he was still trying to run. Confused, Jacob threw a look over his shoulders, and saw the reason why. Krueger was standing in the doorway, his hand raised above him in a fist, as though he was holding on to something. It was Jacob's shadow. Krueger was holding on to his goddamn shadow. And then he was moving backward as Krueger started reeling him in, all the while laughing uproariously. The harder Jacob struggled to free himself, the harder Krueger laughed, until the rooftops were ringing with the sound of his foul cackle. Jacob fell to his knees as he was dragged backward, tears of anger and frustration running down his little 5-year-old face. His fingers scrabbled on the concrete path, searching for a handhold, scraping the skin from his knuckles, but it was no good. Within seconds, he was back outside his house, dragged bodily down the path. As he kicked and struggled, the landscape around him blurred, a white picket fence rising from the lawn like a corpse breaking out of a grave, while the features of the house shifted around as though an army of ghosts was performing a high-speed renovation. Jacob watched as 4 embossed numbers exuded themselves from the wall, clicking neatly into place. 1, 4, 2, 8. Jacob looked up at the numbers and his soul froze. 1428 Elm Street. No, not that house. Anything but that house. Even as Jacob watched, the lights in the house went out. Then kaboom! The windows exploded outwards in a shower of spinning glass shards. Flames ignited in the empty window frames, leaping upward and filling the night air with the sounds of crackling and spitting. The front door creaked open and blood started to pour out. It gushed down the front steps in a crimson tide, then began flowing stickily from the windows, oozing out of the very walls. It flooded down toward Jacob, flowed around him, over him. He tasted its coppery tang in his mouth and spat, repulsed. But more poured over him, drenching his hair, stinging his eyes as he was dragged backward. Freddy Krueger threw back his head and laughed as he hauled Jacob the last few feet up the path, watching his struggle with contempt. He reached down and grabbed the blood-slicked young boy by the hair and hauled him to his feet.
Well, well, well. Looks like school's back in, bitch. Now, Jacob, you weren't trying to run away from Daddy, were you?
Get the fuck off me! You're not my father! Jacob kicked out at Freddy as hard as he could and screamed in his 5-year-old voice. And he twisted in Freddy's grasp, striving to break free. Freddy swung his finger knives downward with a flourish and smacked Jacob around the head.
You kiss your mother with that mouth, boy?
Freddy laughed and hoisted him up into the air.
No? Would you like me to?
His tongue snaked out of his mouth and he waggled it obscenely, then broke into a peal of delighted laughter. You even dream about going near my mother, fuckhead. You're going to be taking your balls home in a bag, Jacob spat.
Strong words, tough guy.
Freddy hoisted Jacob up higher, inspecting him closely. Then his smile dropped off his face as suddenly as if it had been sliced off.
Okay, here's the deal, you little brat. I know what you're doing. Stopping everyone's dreams.
Freddy touched his finger blade to Jacob's throat, and the boy suddenly grew very still, staring up at Freddy with hatred in his eyes. Freddy sniggered and pressed his blade deeper into Jacob's throat. Jacob winced as blood started to flow.
You can't keep it up forever, Jacob. Let people start dreaming again, and I'll let you live.
So kill me. Jacob locked eyes with Freddy, fighting the pain and the fear. He had nothing left to lose. Krueger laughed.
Ain't gonna happen, kiddo. I need you alive. How else can I get through to the kids? You're the only one that remembers me.
The cops remember you, snapped Jacob. Go fuck with them.
Ha! You're a funny guy.
Freddy leaned closer to Jacob's ear. Jacob held his breath as a stench of rotting flesh washed over him.
Doesn't work like that. You know it. I know it.
He dropped his voice to a dry whisper.
I just want the kids. Bring me the kids, and you can live forever, like me.
Screw you! Jacob swung his leg back and kicked at Freddy as hard as he could. His foot caught the killer with a glancing blow on the thigh, and kept going. Jacob yelped in horror as he felt his foot sink into Freddy's leg, as easily as if he was made out of warm butter. Frantically, he pulled backward, trying to extricate himself, but Freddy's flesh clung to him like glue. A sharp, stinging sensation traveled up his leg. Jacob glanced downward and saw with the start that his oversized pants were smoking. A second later, they burst into flames. Jacob yelled in fear as blue flames licked up toward his body. A blistering pain inflamed his leg, and Jacob screamed, jerking and struggling and fighting to free himself from Freddy. Freddy watched him writhe in the flames, his eyes alight with amusement.
Say when!
Go fuck yourself, Jacob gasped. The flames rose higher, then leapt upwards, enveloping him completely. Jacob screamed as the flames washed over him. He reached out with both hands, trying to push himself away from the killer.
Oh, how sweet! You want to hold Daddy's hand?
Krueger chuckled. He wrapped his fingers around Jacob, squeezing hard. A blinding pain exploded in Jacob's fingertips, as though his very bones were trying to pierce his skin. Jacob saw to his horror that Freddy's silver knives were melting, fusing to his own fingers. Let go of me! But it was too late. Jacob wrenched his hand away from Freddy's, but the blades were bonded to his fingers. Jacob shook his hand around in a frenzy, but the knives stayed put. A wisp of smoke rolled off the end of one of the blades as the metal oxidized in the heat. Freddy released Jacob and stepped backward, looking down in approval. The flames went out with a hiss, smoke rising from Jacob's charred skin.
You want me to hold up a mirror so you can see the back?
Jacob staggered, reeling backward. He held up his shaking hand and stared down at it. His own face reflected back to him in 5 slices on the shiny blades. His mouth dropped open in shock. His face was hideously burnt, the flesh peeling and crackling away from his skin. A second face came into view behind his own, reflected on the blades. Kruger's face, burnt and rotting, just like his. Like father, like son. Jacob threw back his head and screamed, and woke up. In a single leap, he was out of bed. He darted across the room, thumped into the door, and pressed himself up against it, shaking with revulsion. His hand flew up to his face, and he stared down frantically at his fingers. They were normal, no sign of any knives anywhere. He tasted blood in his mouth, and it took him a moment or two to realize he'd bitten through his own lip in his sleep. Bile rose in his throat, and for a second he thought that he was going to throw up. He laid his head on the cool metal of the door, and shortly the feeling passed. But his underlying fear held on, squeezing his heart and constricting his chest in an iron grip. After a moment, he tentatively pressed a hand against his throat, where Freddy had scored him with his fingerknives. When he pulled his hand away, there was blood on his fingers. When the shaking in his body had subsided, Jacob wiped his hand on his hospital gown and stumbled back across to his narrow bed. He sprawled full length on it, waiting for his heart rate to return to normal. The floor beneath the bed was dirty, and Jacob saw that even in his holding cell the floor was paved with that same green linoleum with the white flecks. Damn cheap-ass decorators. The pillow was lumpy and hard under his head. Grunting, Jacob pounded on it to soften it up, then slid his hand underneath to turn it over. His fingers touched something hard and metallic. Jacob's face froze. Very carefully, Jacob withdrew his hand from under the pillow, sat up, then got off the bed and backed away from it until his back touched the far wall. He slid down it and sat in the corner as far away from the bed as possible. He stared at it, his eyes wide. In the room next to him, the phone started to ring. Chapter 11. Hello? Is there anybody there? Ella made her way down the corridor toward the dim glow of the red light. She was completely lost in the bowels of the burned-out Medilab, and she was starting to panic. The light seemed to be a hell of a long way away, which worried her, but anything was better than stumbling around blindly in the darkness. The red glow became brighter as she got closer to it, filling the corridor with a dull, sickly light. The air in the corridor was stale and chilly, and the burned walls on either side of her glistened with condensation, turned an oily black by congealed soot. Ella shivered, folding her bare arms and hugging them tight to her chest to conserve heat. The air seemed to be getting warmer the closer she got to the red light, which led her to hope that she had found a way out of this wretched place. She reached the end of the corridor and paused in the doorway, her eyes anxiously scanning the room. The corridor opened out into a large storeroom with a single red bulb hanging down from the low ceiling. It illuminated a room scoured and blackened by the fire, filled with a confusing jumble of burned shapes and fallen beams. The skeletal remains of a dozen lab benches were fused to the floor, and scattered debris covered every horizontal surface. Part of the ceiling had fallen in, and pale moonlight spilled through a broken window on the opposite wall. Glittering shards of glass scattered on the floor in front of it. A movement caught Ella's attention, and she froze, straining her eyes in the gloom. There was somebody here. The figure of a boy was hunched at one side of the room, half hidden in shadow. He was facing away from her, backlit by the moonlight, fixated on something she couldn't quite make out. Something in his manner made Ella pause, her cheery greeting dying away in her throat. She watched him for a couple of seconds, unsure whether to approach him. He was probably just some kid from the party who had got lost like her, but still she was cautious. The boy turned, sensing her presence. For a moment he stood stock still, regarding her unwaveringly, almost quivering with alertness. Ella noticed he was wearing some kind of robe, like a hospital gown. It was stained with what looked like black paint. What was that? Some kind of freaky, fancy dress? Boy, had this kid mixed up his invites tonight. The boy turned his attention away from her and busied himself behind the bench. He made no further acknowledgment of Ella's presence. Ella heard the splash of running water. As the silence grew longer, she crept into the room and stopped by the first bench, as close to him as she dared. "Hey," she said awkwardly. The boy froze and glanced up at her, frowning as if he had already forgotten she was there. Going by his physical stature, he looked no older than 17, but his expression gave away his more advanced age. He was wiry and compact, and had scruffy shoulder-length hair that hung in loose dark ringlets around his face. From beneath it his eyes glittered blackly, regarding her with a ferocity that was anything but friendly. Ella tried again. "Are you lost?" The boy looked her over, his expression wary, almost feral. A wash of unearthly moonlight painted a bright mask over one side of his face. "You could say that," he said finally. Ella smiled, relieved. "Me too. I didn't bring a light with me, and it's kind of dark outside. I have no clue how I got here." Ella smiled and brushed her hair out of her face. "I think I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I'm such a putz." To her surprise, the boy only stared at her blankly. "Door's over there. Use it." Ella's smile faded. She folded her arms and tipped her head to one side, pouting a little. "I just told you I was lost. How am I supposed to get out of here without a light?" Silence. Then water splashed as the boy busied himself in the sink. A muffled, thumping dance beat sounded somewhere in the distance. Ella leaned back against the bench. "I'm asking you to help me." Again the pause, the hard, almost angry stare that followed, and then don't. "Fine." Ella got up and marched around to the other side of the bench. "Have it your way. I'm sure I'm perfectly capable of finding a flashlight in a place like this. Is that blood?" She stared at the boy, who froze, his hand still submerged in the sink. A stray beam of moonlight lit up the water, making it glow a bright red. He pulled his hands out of the sink and quickly wiped them on his robe. "Nah, it's paint. I'm a decorator. Isn't that obvious?" Ella shook her head, not sure whether to be fascinated or horrified. "That doesn't look like paint to me. It's all over you." Ella moved closer, concern supplanting her fear. "What happened? Did you cut yourself on something?" The boy's eyes unconsciously flicked to the window, then back to Ella. He seemed to shrink a little, as though coiling himself for action. "Maybe," he said, as though he was trying out a story on her. "Let me see." Ella moved toward him, then stopped as the boy flinched away from her. Not afraid exactly, just cautious. "What is it?" she asked. The boy's eyes tracked back to the window, then over to the door. "I'm fine. Just go." "I told you, I can't. I'm lost. I have no idea how to get back to the party." Ella gestured toward the ceiling. "The lighting kind of sucks in here." "Party?" The boy stared at her as though she had just told him there was an air raid going on. "Yeah, party. You know, food, drink, dancing, sweaty boys, that kind of thing." Ella decided to try a different track. "Look, I'm sorry I disturbed you, but I can't just leave you like this. You're hurt. Do you want me to call an ambulance or the police?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out her cell phone. The boy reacted so quickly she didn't even see him move. One minute she was holding the cell phone, the next she was staring into the sink at the small ring of bubbles that marked the phone's entry point into the water. "Hey!" She fished it out quickly. Water poured from its mouthpiece and dripped down onto the floor. The boy turned away and began throwing things into the small duffel bag at his feet, moving with a fluid motion that made Ella think of a jungle animal. "It's not safe in here," he muttered. "You should go." "Go? Go where?" Ella was angry now. "This place is like a maze. Escher himself couldn't have done a better job." "I told you. The door's over there." This time he pointed. Ella strained her eyes in the red-tinged gloom, and just about made out a darker rectangle to the side of the room. A second door. "You should get back to your little party. Keep one hand on the wall. Don't take any turns." "I won't." Ella took a step toward the door, slipping her soaked cell phone into her pocket. The boy was facing away from her, rifling through the cupboard under the sink. Weird kid, she thought, but not bad looking. "Hey," she called back. "Do you have a name, just so I know who to curse when I try to call a cab home, and my phone is blowing bubbles at me?" There was the slightest pause. "Jacob." "I'm Ella. It's been interesting." Jacob shrugged. "Likewise. We should do this again sometime." "Okay, but you bring the chips and the dip, okay?" "Suits me." The boy held her gaze for a moment, and Ella felt a rush of something pass between them. She didn't know what it was, but it freaked the hell out of her. Her gaze slipped downward. His stained gown was open at the top, and she could just make out the pale lines of a white scar running across the top of his chest. One long line. 2 downward strokes. Almost like the tops of 2 letters. She felt the boy's eyes and looked up to see that he was glaring at her. His expression was dark. "Seen enough?" "What happened to you?" was all she could manage. "Ask Freddy. He's the one trying to kill me." The boy gave a short, humorless laugh, then slung his bag over his shoulder and started toward the door. "Don't dream, or he'll get you too. I'm going to try to stop him. Wish me luck." "Freddy?" A faint bell rang in the back of Ella's mind. "Freddy who? And what do you mean, don't dream?" But the boy was gone. The door banged shut behind him. "Hey!" Ella ran forward and yanked the door open. She paused, peering anxiously into the pitch blackness on the other side. "Freddy who?" she shouted. If the boy heard her, he didn't reply. The corridor was quiet, save the far-off beat of the music, but she couldn't even hear footsteps. It was as though he had just vanished into the night. Ella started forward into the darkness, walking as quickly as she dared, one hand on the wall, her other thrust blindly out in front of her. After 30 seconds, a flashing light off to her left caught her attention. Ella hesitated, then struck out at a right angle toward the lights. The music got louder the further she walked, and in less than a minute her fingers brushed against the metal frame of a door. She groped around, located the handle, and flung the door open. Light flooded her senses, and she squinted in pain, shielding her eyes with her hands. She was back in the main party room. The door opened out onto a metal catwalk that ringed the lab, and below her the party was in full swing. Almost beside herself with relief, Ella closed the door firmly, then walked to the edge of the gantry and peered down at the packed masses of revelers. A techno stomper by Static X was playing, and the room was alive, with people jumping, people dancing, and people laughing. Everyone looked like they were having a great time. Ella's eyes scanned the crowd, but there was no sign of the boy. He had completely vanished. She searched for her friends, but she couldn't see a familiar face. Jen and Dimitri were probably off in some dark storeroom somewhere making out, she guessed, and Nikki and Henry were nowhere in sight. Ella quickly made her way down the steps to rejoin the crowd on the dance floor. The packed room seemed uncomfortably hot, and the music was almost painfully loud. Ella pushed her way through the packed masses, tired and not at all in the mood for all of this revelry. After a few steps, a girl clad in thigh-high vinyl boots jostled her, shrieking with merriment. Ella grimaced and shoved her aside, wishing that she'd stayed home tonight. Someone's cigarette burned her leg. As she jerked away from it, she collided with a tall boy carrying 2 beer jugs. Beer sloshed down her front, and the boy threw her a disgusted look before disappearing into the throng. Okay, that did it. She was leaving. There was a payphone out the front of the school. She would call a taxi and be home in under half an hour. Ella thought longingly of her bed, then realized she should at least try to find the others and tell them she was leaving. A couple more steps and she was out onto the makeshift dance floor. The crowd was less densely packed here, and Ella made her way quickly around the edge of the seething masses of bodies, on the lookout for her gang. A familiar face jumped out at her, and she started forward in relief. Then she stopped, her mouth hanging open in dismay. Nikki and Henry were dancing together. Nikki's long dark hair flew around her as she twisted and shimmied, hands above her head, gyrating her hips to the pulse of the music, and gazing deeply into Henry's eyes. Henry had one hand around her waist and the other on her shoulder, and from the grin on his face he was enjoying himself immensely. The pair of them seemed oblivious to everyone else. Ella's eyebrows flew to the top of her head. She hadn't even known that those two liked each other. In that way, she'd only been gone a short time. The pair was obviously having fun, but as she watched her friends dance together, Ella felt resentment start to creep in. She would probably be the only one going home alone tonight. True, she was tired and cranky, but that wasn't the point. Everyone else seemed to be having the time of their lives, while she was the one who got arrested and lost and had to talk to weird boys covered in blood. It was just typical of her life at that moment. She turned her heated gaze back onto her friends, knowing that she should be happy for them, but unable to muster anything beyond a bleak depression. They were dancing closer now, their hips pressed together. She watched Nicky lean into Henry and gaze dreamily into his eyes, as if he was the hero of a romance novel. It was so cute, it was almost sickening. Ellen knew that she should just leave them, but a perverse part of her wanted to share the story of how crappy her night had been. That was what friends were supposed to be for, after all, right? She hung back, composing her thoughts, then stepped resolutely onto the dance floor. Reaching the pair, she tapped Nicky on the shoulder. "Hey, girl," she said. Nicky unwound her arms from around Henry's neck. "Hey," she said shyly. She gazed at Ella in concern, then leaned in closer and dropped her voice. "What are you doing?" "Leaving?" Ella shook her head. "You will not believe the evening I'm having. Tonight has been the full 9 circles of hell." Nicky looked at her weirdly. "But we've only just got here," she whispered. "I know, sorry." Ella tried to smile. "I'm not in the mood to cope with this. I guess I'm just tired." "But your dress. You spent hours getting ready." "What, this old thing? It took me like 5 minutes to—" Ella looked down at herself, and her voice trailed off into silence. A great expanse of white material billowed out beneath her, flared out at the bottom like an old-fashioned ball gown. Lacy patterns traced their way down the garment, ending in a series of pleated ruffles, more at home on her grandmother's curtains than on something Ella would willingly wear in public. Her hands instinctively flew to her sides to touch the dress, and she discovered she was wearing elbow-length silk gloves, just like her mom used to wear to weddings. She looked down at her feet and noticed she was wearing antique-looking satin slippers. A look of stunned bemusement crept slowly across her face. She stood frozen in confusion while the music blared around her. Nicky?" she said very carefully. "What am I wearing?" "Your dress, silly," Nicky tittered. Ella blinked. Nicky was suddenly wearing a big white dress too, an even more whacked-out ball gown. Her hair was up in a fancy French braid, and she wore a pearl necklace around her throat. How had she changed so quickly? Had someone slipped drugs into Ella's drink? Ella took a deep breath, then grimaced and tried again. Her lungs wouldn't expand properly. Was she having some kind of fit? She ran her hands up over her ribcage and got her answer. She was wearing a corset. Henry stepped forward, looking concerned. He was wearing a ridiculous black suit with tails and a starched white shirt. His usual punk rock hairdo was smoothed down with a gallon of hair gel plastered across his scalp. "Are you all right?" he asked her, eloquently. Ella backed away, her brain whirling inside of her skull. "I'm insane," she muttered. "That must be it. I've gone clinically insane." Her feverish gaze roved around the room. The entire crowd was dressed in the same crazy style, the leather and the vinyl and denim replaced by a shimmering sea of satin and pristine pastel cotton. The candlelight picked out a scene that was more like an Elizabethan costume drama than a 21st century party. Young girls swung elegantly around their tuxedoed partners, their hair piled high, their cheeks robed. The chatter of polite conversation filled the room, broken by the occasional girlish giggle. The DJ's booth was gone, and in its place was a string quartet, the lead violinist plucking out an intricate melody that sounded suspiciously like an acoustic rendition of a Static X song. Okay, that was it. She was losing it. What was it that woman at the police station had said about hallucinations? "Would you like to sit down?" Nicky's eyes were wide with concern. "There's a bench right over there." Ella looked. There was indeed a bench, right on the edge of the dance floor. It was white and had gilded swans painted on the back of it. Ella swayed on her feet and felt gentle hands guiding her off the dance floor. Bewildered, she let herself be led to the bench and sat down awkwardly, mammoth folds of dress material bunching up on either side of her. The band started up again, and Ella's attention was drawn magnetically back to the dancing figures of Nicky and Henry. She watched them with a detached interest. Despite their weird costumes, they did look good together. Ella wondered why she hadn't thought of pairing them up together a long time ago. She watched as they twirled each other around, moving together in a gracefully synchronized dance. They looked like they had both spent years learning it, and Ella was impressed. Talk about hidden depth. She hadn't known that Nicky could dance at all. What a great evening! Nicky watched the room spin around her, smiling delightedly, her glossy black hair flying out like a dark raven's wing. Henry took her hand and spun her around twice more before pulling her back to him. He looked so handsome in his black tuxedo, with his gold pocket watch swinging from a chain. He took a step back and bowed to her, and Nicky curtsied in return. Then the pair of them launched into a crazy country dance number that nearly caused her to lose her shoes. Nicky threw back her head and laughed. She was having so much fun. And to think that she'd nearly stayed at home this evening. Nicky winked at Henry, swirling her skirts. The band kicked up into a higher tempo, and she grabbed Henry's hand and swung herself around him, skillfully avoiding the couple spinning and twirling around her. Henry pulled her in close at the end of her swing, twining his fingers with hers, and drew her tightly into his body. Her eyes locked with his. Nicky dropped her gaze coyly and giggled. He was such a doll. She wondered if he would hold hands with her when he walked her home tonight. Perhaps he would even kiss her on the cheek. The tempo to the song sped up still further, and Nicky paused a second to get her breath back before starting a new dance. The whalebone corset she was wearing was pressing on her lungs again, making it hard to breathe. She recomposed herself and hoisted her smile back up. She had to keep up appearances. After 3 minutes, she was sweating in a very unladylike fashion. She couldn't seem to catch her breath. Nicky started panting, feeling a wave of dizziness as her body demanded oxygen that she couldn't give it. Her vision darkened momentarily, and she reeled a little, then reached up to wipe her forehead, her smile fixed. When was this song ever going to end? She staggered to one side for a moment and glanced around, searching for an escape route. But as she did so, an older gentleman caught her by the arm and twirled her back into the heart of things. She politely stepped around him, avoiding eye contact, but he held onto her arm and used her own momentum to spin her around until she was facing him. She looked up at the man, a weak smile on her lips. He was in his mid-30s, with piercing blue eyes, a high hairline, and dirty blonde hair that was graying slightly around the temples. He had tanned, freckled skin with just a hint of stubble, and wore a gray frock-tailed coat with what looked like riding boots. The only bold colors in his costume came from his undershirt, which was colored gaily in bold stripes of green and red. Nicky politely curtsied to him, feeling strangely nervous. The man still hadn't let go of her hand and was starting to make her feel uncomfortable. His grip was much firmer than she would have liked, and his hand was cold and clammy. She smiled again, hoping that he would get the hint and let go, but he only gripped her more tightly. She glanced around, but Henry was nowhere to be seen. As she dithered, the stranger pulled her in close to him. "What's your name?" he asked. His breath was stale and stank of tobacco and rum, and his voice was very rough, but at the same time elegant. Nicky pulled away from him slightly. Her eyes were still scanning the room. "What's it to you?" "Everything, my dear." The man grinned, revealing dirty yellow teeth. "My name's Susanna," lied Nicky. "Pleased to meet you." She shrugged, non-committal. "Except it's not, is it?" "Excuse me?" The man smiled again, his gaze mocking. "Your name? It's not Susanna." "Course it is. How do you—" The man rounded on her.
You're lying to me, Nikki. I hate it when people lie to me.
I'm not lying.
Sure you're not.
The man's voice dripped with sarcasm. His cold eyes locked with hers, and Nikki felt the chill stab through her, like an ice pick to the gut. His gaze seemed to pierce through to the back of her head, and in a split second Nikki realized without a shadow of a doubt that he knew. About everything. About her life. About her lies. About her. She didn't know how he knew, but he knew everything. The man was still holding her hand. Nikki looked up at him, the smile frozen to her face. Behind her, the band launched into a polka number. The man sniffed.
Truth is, Nikki, you're a little phony. Always have been, always will be. You can't face the fact that you're a boring little bitch with no life and no friends. And the only reason you're here is that you're too stupid to realize that nobody likes you.
All of this was delivered in such a rough but pleasant tone of voice that it took Nikki a couple of seconds to catch up with what had just been said. For a moment, her face registered shock. Then her expression slid through disbelief back into anger. Now hold on a moment, she protested.
Can it, bitch?
The man grinned again, but this time there was no trace of humor in his voice, and it was much, much rougher.
You're nobody. You're nothing. You think these guys like you? Bullshit!
He leaned in closer, squeezing her hand tightly.
They pity you. That's all.
Nikki felt her face flush hotly. Despite herself, tears prickled behind her eyes. They do like me, she whispered.
Ah, what was that? You'll have to speak up, you little attention junkie whore.
I said...
Oh, forget it. Who the fuck cares? You could drop dead right here, and nobody would give a damn. Except for the worms, of course. And they'd just be pissed, 'cause they'd have to chew on you. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here, looking like that.
He gestured down at her dress.
What do you think this is? Halloween?
Nikki dropped her head, cursing the tears that had started to flow. The man's words stung her soul. He was wrong. He didn't know. She tried to pull her hand away, but he was holding it too tightly. Let go, she said. She tugged again. I said let go.
Oh, give it up.
The man grabbed her other hand and yanked Nikki around, spinning her away from him and then back again. She stumbled. Stop it!
No, you stop it, you dirty little bitch.
The man smiled cruelly, his gaze seeking hers like a wasp drawn to sugar.
Except you can't, can you? Tell a lie often enough, and...
He sneered and shook his head, looking her up and down.
You're just a joke. You might fool the others with your song and dance, but you can't fool me. Honestly, girl, you just make me sick.
With the sob, Nikki broke free from the man's grip and lurched away from him. In a frenzy, she ran around the edge of the dance floor, searching for a way out. There was none. The crowd was packed too tight. She felt people's eyes on her and heard a ripple of conversation spread in her wake. What's she doing here? What a tramp. Look at her dress. I didn't invite her, did you? A spotlight suddenly stabbed down, out of the darkness, and pinned on her, cowering to the dance floor. People stepped away from her expectantly, and a smattering of light applause rose from the rest of the room. Nikki looked up timidly, her eyes red, her cheeks streaked with tears. The man stood in the center of the room under a second spotlight, one hand outstretched toward her. He was wearing a top hat, and in his other hand he held a ruby-topped cane. He looked almost dapper, except for that awful grin. Nikki cleared her throat in the resultant hush, her eyes flicking around the room like a trapped animal. Behind her, she heard the conductor tapping a stick on the music stand. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The band struck up, playing a waltz this time. Nikki's feet started moving on their own accord, kicking and tapping and spinning her back toward her partner. while the audience applauded. Then she was back in the man's foul embrace, and they were moving together, waltzing around the room. His fingers locked painfully tight around the bone of her wrist, grinding the bones together, while the other hand ran down her body and lingered on the curve of her hip. She felt his warm, damp breath on her cheek and shuddered in disgust, but found she was unable to pull away from him. The man threw her into a quick spin, and the crowd cheered. And as he pulled her back in, a sharp pain stabbed through Nikki's arm. She looked down. Blood was trickling out from beneath the bandages on her arm. As she watched, the one on her wrist slipped down to reveal a large, angry-looking gash. But this wasn't the fake wound she had spent half an hour painstakingly creating in her bedroom with her special makeup effects kit. No, this wound was real. Both bandages suddenly vanished in a flash of orange flame, scorching her skin and revealing horrific injuries beneath. Nikki gave a shriek of fright as the man reached up and grabbed hold of her other hand, squeezing tightly. Blood flowed from her engorged veins, pattering down and staining her white dress. Then he laughed and twirled her around again, his feet skidding on the blood-slicked floor.
"You want to be a victim so bad? Try this!"
Nikki flinched as an invisible blow struck her full in the face. The left side of her face started throbbing, and she found that she couldn't see out of her left eye as it rapidly swelled shut. A second blow split her lip, and a third sent her reeling. Unseen hands grabbed her and threw her about, and fresh bruises in the shape of finger marks flared on the inside of her upper arms. Nikki struck out at them, flailing madly with her free hand. "Stop it! Stop it! Please stop it!" The band sped up again, and Nikki's feet obeyed, moving of their own accord, keeping pace with the music. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her lungs heaved as she struggled to catch her breath. The man whirled her around again, roaring with laughter. Nikki began coughing, fighting to draw a breath from deep within her corset. It seemed to be getting tighter by the second, squeezing the air out of her lungs like a boa constrictor. Her feet flew back and forth, and smoke started to rise from beneath her skirts as her shoes began to smolder.
"Are we having fun yet? Things are looking hot!"
Nikki opened her mouth to reply, but the wind whipped the words out of her mouth. Her vision swam with blackness, and she realized that she was about to pass out. The music drew to a climax, and the man spun her around so fast that she became a blur, then yanked her backward and caught her on his arm, leaning over her as though about to kiss her. The band crashed a final note, and they froze, a perfect silhouette in the spotlight. The audience broke into rapturous applause. Nikki stared up at the ceiling, wide-eyed. Something felt wrong inside her body. She gasped, and her mouth suddenly flooded with blood. She spat, repulsed, but more flowed up her throat, as though she was somehow leaking from the inside. She rocked her head forward and looked down slowly. There were knives protruding from her chest. The man had stabbed her right through the back. He stared down at her as though she were an insect on a pin.
"Hey, kid, don't let me keep you hanging around."
Abruptly, he pulled the knives out of her back, releasing her. Fire belched out of the wound, spreading upwards to engulf her body.
"Oh, and tell everyone in hell that Freddy sends his best."
"Freddy?" Nikki's lips barely moved. Then she spun down, downward, falling toward the floor in slow motion, as the world around her faded away. And through the flames she heard the man's voice, laughing at her.
Never sleep again.
Okay, this has been chapters 10 and 11 of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream. And I think tonight's chapters were awesome. I'm sorry for the little bait and switch in the first part of tonight's narration, but the book read like trying to make the person reading it think that it's Freddy. So I had to convey that, throwing in little bits of Freddy's voice a little bit to give you that feeling as well, before the reveal that it was actually Cain who had a victim tied up and everything. But other than that, the rest of the chapters, man, all this with Jacob, his dream with Freddy getting turned into a kid. You know, Freddy saying, "Looks like school's back in, bitch." That was pretty cool. To any fans that remember, "School's out, Freddy," you know, when Jacob told him that. God, so much happened tonight. And it looks like our kill count gets 1 tonight, unless it changes later in the book. For now, Nikki has been ultimately backstabbed by Freddy Krueger. And I gotta say, the imagery that was portrayed in the words by this author for that dream of the Victorian-style gown and all that, she's at this dance, Freddy in the tuxedo, the way he spoke to her, the way her fake wounds started to become real, I felt like I was in a Freddy movie. I thought it was amazingly written. You can play it out in your head so vividly. So well done to Krista Faust on that one. Very good job in her writing there. Alright guys, I'll be back tomorrow with some more of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
See you in your dreams!